Hello, I'm Soycat, and welcome back to the second channel geography video. The world map might be changing soon, and that kind of comes down to the debate about what does it take for a country to get its own passport. You might argue that if you have your own territory and your own unique people group, then you should get a passport, and that's what the Cook Islands argue. However, New Zealand says no. That is a real headline. New Zealand believes that only fully independent countries should have their own passports, and this is something they believe because right now the Cook Islands are managed as a realm country of New Zealand. This means they pay a monthly subscription fee to Microsoft and... sorry, that's something else. This means they're kind of analogous to Puerto Rico to the United States or Greenland to Denmark, where these places look very different and behave very self-governingly. However, their defense and their international relations are managed by the larger country. This is how the Cook Islands function with New Zealand, because New Zealand, when you look at it on a map, I know it's always fun to be like, oh yeah, New Zealand is a, colony that has its own colonies, but it sort of is. This is New Zealand right here, and this is what most people picture, North Island, South Island, but there's a whole ton of other islands that are part of the New Zealand claim. This is the New Zealand realm, which is very, very interesting, and as you can see, includes all sorts of odd islands, but in particular, and also a slice of Antarctica. We'll have to leave to the side today, but interestingly, it also includes Niue and the Cook Islands. The Cook Islands are the most interesting and always the most active of all of these because New Zealand has about 100,000 people from the Cook Islands living in that country. All of these people therefore get all of the fun benefits of New Zealand citizenship, being able to work and access healthcare in New Zealand and live there freely because they are just a part of New Zealand right now. However, as you always will see when, again, the number of people who live in the Cook Islands is about 15,000, whereas 100,000 of those live in New Zealand. When you have such a small country that has a large percent of its population that is economically integrated with a neighbor, there's always going to be a little bit of nationalism amongst the few who remain. And so what has happened in this case? Well, the people are simply saying, yeah, a lot of people are free to carry dual passports, and so maybe we should have our own passport as well. People who live in the Cook Islands should have some fun benefit for being a Cook Islander. However, people who are Cook Islanders living in New Zealand go, ooh, have you consulted us on this decision? Is this going to be bad? And more or less, New Zealand's response to this whole thing has said, yeah, well, obviously, any change to the relationship has to go for a referendum, and you'd have to weigh up whether you prefer the status quo with all the benefits of it, or if you want full independence. And what I think is wild, and so this comes from Winston Peters, who is a very, very interesting New Zealand politician, he basically says, if the goal of the Cook Islands is full independence from New Zealand, then of course that's a conversation we're ready for them to initiate. In other words, saying, if you want a passport, you can go independent. If you want to, we're not going to force you to stay as part of us. Feel free to go out on your own run, And I think that's that's the only correct stance you can have with territories nowadays. It's weird, because if, the South Island wanted to secede, that would be a big territorial question, and every country has their, bits of their country where it's like, oh, if it's connected to the rest of the country, you're allowed to be mad when people ask it to leave, such as is the case in Spain, such as isn't the case in all sorts of other places around the world. If Texas tried to secede from the United States, or if Saskatchewan tried to secede from Canada, you're allowed to say that we have the territorial control of anything that touches you. However, in general, in the international world, if a territory is too far from your capital, the world says, hey, if they want their own thing, you have to let them have it. And so that's the weird place that the Cook Islands fall into. So are the Cook Islands going to go independent? Well, I want to say that this is a interesting, kind of update to the idea of, when we talk about new countries that might exist, they almost all have to come from existing countries, but you kind of forget there are lots of places that are already halfway out the door. The other big example being, again, let's be honest, you only think about it so much because it's so big on the Mercator-style projection, but, Greenland, but it is a very big island in general. Greenland is the place that everyone thinks of because you see it on a map and it's labeled Greenland, in the same way that Puerto Rico is labeled Puerto Rico, and so you think to yourself, that must be a country, and you're always surprised when it's not. Apparently, one of the people who is surprised is the soon-to-be US president, and so Greenland's gone through the whole thing repeatedly again of saying, we're not for sale, but they've got the same situation that the Cook Islands have, where if you are very heavily economically reliant on your host country, I think it's slightly less subsidy from New Zealand to the Cook Islands, but it still is there, right? When you are reliant on them for everything, you can have this big nationalist stance that Greenland belongs to the people of Greenland, but actually, no, Greenland belongs to the people of Denmark. It is you can disagree with that and you can say it's just an autonomous Danish territory, but ultimately, Denmark needs something done in the territory. Who's the one who makes those end calls, right? And so that's the very interesting point about self-governing places. Right now, I think it is a more efficient way for a place to be. Again, if you think about the population of Greenland and how it's smaller than the town you grew up in, unless you grew up in a small town, my bad. But statistically, where you live, you probably grew up in a place that has a higher population population than all of Greenland. And so, you know, when you talk about small territories, like, let's pick another fun one, like, apparently in the South Pacific, when you're thinking of places like Niue, which, by the way, look at the size of this island. Running this island as a country is possible. You know, there are small countries out there that basically have done this, but also is very inefficient, or if it's not inefficient, you're going to end up with lack of, you know, defense and foreign services. There are certain things that just make sense basically to subcontract out. It doesn't make sense when you're the size of Australia. It doesn't make sense when you get to Indonesia level. But if you are like a, you know, let's pick another fun collection of islands. If you are this island right here, you might believe that the people on your island are real great and deserve their own full independence, but maybe it's just easier to let the Indian Air Force, I'm guessing that's what IAF stands for here. Maybe it's better to just let India carry all of that for you, and maybe you agree, maybe you disagree, but that's the interesting thing about the world. Also an interesting thing about the world and kind of changing passports, because I had to immediately research in response to this, like, okay, so basically these people believe that they can have their own passport. New Zealand says no. Fully independent countries get their own passport. I would like to issue a little bit of fun correction to that, though, because did you know, actually not really that true. So here is a list of passports. As you can see, it's every single country's passport, but as you'll mix up in here, like, oh, and then there's passports for, like, St. Helena, and if we go to Europe, the most interesting one to me is, like, oh yeah, the Åland Islands. So these are a place that were, like, kind of disputed between Finland and Sweden for a little bit. They have, they're the weirdest part of the European continent, to be honest. It's easy to pretend they don't exist if you don't want to mess yourself up, but it's an autonomous region with its own government that speak its whole own separate language over there, and so the Åland Islands are Finnish citizens, but they get their own passport. As you can see, it says the Åland Islands on there, and the same is true for the Faroe Islands in Denmark. The same is true for Greenlandic people. I don't see the bit passport here, so it can't be true, apparently. But the same is true for the Isle of Man. The same is true for Jersey, as you can see. It says the Bailiwick of Jersey, while also saying it's a British passport, which, interestingly enough, by the way, I want to talk about travel in a little bit, but interesting enough, all countries that are part of the EU actually then have the next tier of hierarchy up. You're not just a part of Deutschland, you're a part of the Europäische Union, or the Union Européenne, or whatever you want to say, you know, like, this is what every country has to say, which is why you get to the really interesting level of, like, oh yeah, you're part of Åland, inside of Finland, inside of the European Union, which was also true for certain British passports, if I'm not mistaken, back when we were EU members. But yeah, this EU thing is interesting because Iceland's incoming government has said it will put EU membership to referendum by 2027. By the way, I don't think I actually went through the comments where Greenland has to... one of the fun things about this guy being president is Denmark every now and then has to come out and say, look, we're not selling our territory, that's not how this works. But I totally think they would for the right amount of money. I'm just saying, you can't come out and say that publicly. In the same way you're not meant to come out and publicly say you want to buy Greenland or invade Canada. But like I think totally you would sell the territory, right? There's an amount of money where you'd say, look, we will look very bad, but we'll be set for life. You know, how many Danish citizens are there? Let's just say it's 10 million for the sake of rounding. Getting it a little bit wrong there. If there's 10 million people, you give us 10 billion. That's $1,000 per Danish citizen. That's nice. What about if it's like what's 100 billion? That's 10,000. Maybe at that point you can say, you know, Greenlandic people might actually prefer America or already run the bases. You know, I feel like all territory is implicitly for sold as long as it has. Again, it'd be rude to offer to buy the Occitan region of France. It'd be rude to offer to buy the Basque County, and it'd be rude for the UK to come in and ask to buy Maine. But I think it's totally fine for the UK to ask to buy Hawaii, and I'm just saying, you look at Hawaii, you take a glance at their flag, and it looks like they're looking for that offer already. Okay, sorry, I went a little bit off tangent here. Did you know Iceland is looking to join the EU again? This is something that basically every EFTA state, that's where this map came from, basically every EFTA state has said at some point, like, no, there is a reason that this is as close as we are getting. But yeah, basically Iceland has finally said, like, okay, given how things are going, maybe we should just join the EU potentially. A large number of people, about 54% of people, are now in favor of joining the bloc, whereas previously, given that they are such a big fishing country, I mean, if you can imagine sorry, this is not Iceland anymore. It's actually the exact opposite of Iceland, I can imagine. But you can see that if we go to Iceland, they have a huge amount of sea. They don't need to have a military, and they're in a very good situation where they they feel like being outside of Europe but partially integrated works. But now the newest government believes that maybe they could actually join. And what would be interesting is if they potentially have a referendum in 2027, they still might be the newest EU member. This is wild because Serbia has been, they were going to join in 2020. Obviously, there was a pandemic. They were going to join in 2025. And now there's a big move in 2028, which is what Western Balkan countries are aiming to go through. And it looks like Serbia's saying like, but 2028 seems so soon. Maybe in a decade, we can maybe start moving this. But basically, Serbia has started distancing themselves from the EU just a tiny bit, which is crazy if you ask me. That like, yeah, Serbia, it looked like the EU was gaining 2 new members, and instead of gaining 2 really new members, it's going to have Iceland in there, which is also interesting because Iceland kind of is more integrated with the EU right now than some EU countries were until literally earlier this month. Romania and Bulgaria have joined the Schengen area, the EU border-free zone if you want to simplify it. And what's really interesting about this is the fact that if we dive into it a little bit, the president of the EU says it's a day of joy, that's nice. But if you look into it, it actually isn't like fully integrated yet. So Hungary currently has a inspection of every single truck, and so it's still going to take like months or years before every part of Romania and Bulgaria are fully Schengen. But the fact that it has happened is a good sign for the EU if you are someone who likes to travel by car and want to currently go from like Portugal to Greece, let's say, because now the gap between Hungary and Greece has been closed, which is a very good piece of news, if you ask me. Speaking of good pieces of news, let's now slide across. Okay, so this is really interesting to me that, like, yeah, the EFTA, so Norway, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and Iceland were currently more in the EU in certain ways than member states like Ireland or Bulgaria ever were, which is an interesting point about, like, how the EU works. No other country-like entity is like, yeah, you pick and choose some of the rules. Like, every United States territory has the same, we run the passport control here, and indeed, the same is true for certain places like New Zealand, and I just think it's interesting how every country picks and chooses their own thing, because I was looking, okay, full tangent mode now, I think we've gone through everything important. I was looking recently into going into, because Tanzania is fascinating to me, that like Zanzibar and Tanganyika, I think it was, are the 2 places that merged to create it, and so this is Zanzibar right here, which you only ever hear about in like weird 50s detective movies or something like that, or like weird murder movies, I should say. But Zanzibar is over here, this like mythical place, and apparently Zanzibar runs its own passport control separate to the rest of Tanzania. And that just makes you question like, oh, that's interesting, right? So what is the link between the 2 places, really? And it makes you realize that lots of countries do have their own models, and so that even when you say there's 194 countries, it's kind of a messy point, because lots of countries are very, very similar to each other. The Baltics are the ones I always pick here. They do have their own laws and their own different policies and systems and stuff, but then there can be parts of an individual country that are much more far apart. I think, from St. John in Newfoundland all the way out to Nunavut. I was looking into White. If you ever want to feel like you're scared, if you feel like isolated, I feel like going to one of the Canadian territories is the answer to that. You can be out here and just be like, man, I am so far from another human being, unless you live in this industrial park in Mayo. That's fun. That's a fun name for a place. Anyway, if you look at just how few roads there are of Street View, that kind of gives you a clue about how nothing this place can be. But anyway, so the point here is I was going to say that countries do things differently, and that's interesting. But yeah, so I'm about to visit a bunch of countries. I want to talk about them soon, but next year I want to go to a bunch more places. Here is my map of the world so far. I feel like it's missing quite a bit of, quite a few places. So I have a few different trips I'm planning to maybe tick off some more of the Middle East, to tick off I feel like I'd like to see a few more places. And one of the ways that I like to define, like, how do you visit a place? Because some people say if you're on the territory, like, if your plane lands even for a bit, you're on the country's territory. Some people would say, like, no, you've got to be out of the airport. But I always use the model of, like, okay, if you can go to the McDonald's, if you've been to a McDonald's in a country and it's not an airport McDonald's, even if it's an airport McDonald's, you're not screw it. But I feel like if you've gone to the McDonald's, that's fine. But I'm about to go to 5 countries in January that are all in the non-McDonald's camp. I can understand being in the former McDonald's camp, What happened to Kazakhstan McDonald's, by the way? Sad. But I can understand being in the former McDonald's camp like Iceland. However, never having a McDonald's is something that really does change. And so, yeah, how do we define visiting a country if I am going to be in a place for, say, 12-ish hours? How would I define having visited it? I have, so that's a question I'd like to leave for you down below. Otherwise, here's a bunch of maps that I collected for various videos that I feel like I just never really put together. Like, so I wanted to talk about healthcare around the world. A lot of people think that most of the world has universal healthcare, but actually, not even most of Europe has universal. It's usually some form of like public insurance based, which is very interesting to me. The other systems are like, the other interesting things I wanted to talk about: the death penalty, you know, the idea of the death penalty, the life penalty, the idea of how many executions there are in the world is very, very interesting to me. If you look at where those executions come from, it's also very interesting. There's a lot of stuff that I just haven't put into a place, and hopefully you found this video interesting. And if you have, then just remember, if you want your own passport, you do have to set up your own country. But if you feel like doing that, you can have your own passport and it can be beautiful. Look at the Uzbekistan passport. Yeah, that's a nice one. Actually, I think Switzerland. I feel like Switzerland likes the reason that Switzerland. I mentioned like, oh, maybe Norway might join the EU one day. The idea of Switzerland joining the EU is so foreign. They have such a goofy but delicious, I think delightful. I'm gonna say delicious, actually. If you have a Swiss passport and you don't mind me eating it, hit me up, let me know. But Switzerland is I feel like the country that's gonna be the weird, like, edge of Europe forever. Ooh, Transnistria has its own passport. I had a Transnistrian lodger. So I thought, you know, I want to tell this story at some point, but I had someone living in my house, and I thought it was already unique they were from Moldova. But at one point I was like, could you like tell me where? I'm just like interested in geography. And they're like, oh yeah, it was just over the river, just past Tiraspol there. And I'm like, so you're from Transnistria? She's like, oh yeah, some of the people there call it that. That's and I was like, I discovered this like right as she left. She was, there were lots of fun stories to tell about that. But for now, thank you for watching. Unless you're from Transnistria, in which case, you know, I don't thank you for watching. If you have enjoyed the Toycat videos this year, then don't forget to do things that you like to videos, namely give me money by going to Patreon. A surprised number of people are supporting there. It is a way to encourage me to make the videos on this channel, because right now this is a fun little hobby, but if you want it to be more than that, you can give me money. Or, let's be honest, I'll use the money you give me, and I'll buy McDonald's in loads of countries around the world in 2024. Guess where I'm going if I'm going to 5 places that don't have a McDonald's. See if you can work it out. But otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this year of stuff from the channel, and I look forward to sharing some weird, goofy, bizarre travel things, as well as news, as well as map videos in the next year. I'm saying this like this is the last video of the year. There'll probably be more. Yeah, actually, let's close off the recap, and let's say thank you for watching. Second channel, don't care. Bye!